Welcome to Barnstable Land Trust's presentation on alternative possibilities for the Hyannis Twin Brooks Golf Course. My name is Janet Milkman. I'm the Executive Director of the Barnstable Land Trust. And with me are Matthew Littell and Andrea Baena of Util, the planning and design firm we hired for this project. Our agenda for this presentation includes setting the context for this development and our approach, why this discussion is so important, what the alternatives might be, and how they can happen. LMC, one of the nation's largest home builders, is proposing what is currently the largest development in Hyannis on one of the largest remaining open spaces in a community that is already underserved for open space. Hyannis is the Cape's downtown. It's one of the densest communities on the Cape. And while Barnstable Land Trust is a conservation organization, we recognize the importance of housing for our community. And in seeking a constructive role to play around this development, we've taken a three-pronged approach. First, we've written to the owner to let him know of our interest in conserving this property should the agreement fall through. Second, we've engaged with the Cape Cod Commission to seek to change the way they regulate perceived open spaces, such as golf courses. And finally, with input from the community, we are trying to provide a vision and creativity to support the town's negotiations over this proposal. I should note that the engagement with the Cape Cod Commission has already had an impact. The Commission has begun a stakeholder working group, and you can learn more about that on our webpage, which is www.blt.org/twin-brooks, and we'll give you that information again at the end of the presentation. But with only 16% of the Cape left open for development or conservation, this is a very important conversation. The proposed development is 312 units, all apartments from studios to 3 bedrooms in 13 3-story buildings around surface parking. Monthly rents range from the mid-1000s to the upper 2000s, with 10% affordable units. The project requires Cape Cod Commission approval and approval of the town of Barnstable through developers agreements and a regulatory agreement. It's helpful to know that there is already a lot of new housing underway in Hyannis. According to the town planning department, there are currently 854 units either recently completed or in the planning pipeline. Some are near the West End Rotary, some are in the East End with walkable access to jobs and transportation. The town has also studied underutilized parking lots for potential housing development. And they've done a lot already, which is really important and perhaps not well known. We've made this effort a priority in order to help the town be proactive around community design rather than reactive, to explore alternatives that balance housing and open space. And because this project has a potential to set a precedent in Barnstable and across the Cape for how we treat perceived open spaces like golf courses. And it's also important because the public has the power to influence this development plan through the commission process, through the town process. So change is possible. We began last fall with an analysis and community engagement process and are now ready to release our ideas. We heard from hundreds of community members through meetings, our survey, the media, and a project at Barnstable High School. We heard from year-round residents, from members of the Brazilian community, from No Place for Hate, and from future generations. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matthew Littell to provide more detail on what we learned from the community and to discuss the resulting alternatives.
We conducted a survey that was very well responded to and tried to capture a variety of different types of residents. We received over 150 responses, most of which were full-time residents of Cape Cod living in Barnstable and Hyannis. It's also worth mentioning that the survey results do reflect what we heard in our in-person meetings, including with the Brazilian community, neighbors, and interest groups. There were a range of questions, one of which was about environmental conservation over development, and there seems to be a strong tilt towards some measure of preservation on these sites. There was also a strong interest in improving the health of the underlying ecology of this area, particularly improving the health of the wetlands and the streams. There was also a preference for some sort of pathway or some sort of way that the neighborhoods could actually connect through these properties in open space through use of nature trails. There was also a lot of interest in other types of uses for this open space as well. More specifically, there was fairly broad support for the idea of some sort of a loop that would connect C Street back up through Stewart's Creek, so that this site would not just be a kind of isolated destination, but perhaps part of a broader open space network that connected the neighborhood, the harbor, and the golf course site. Of those that favored some type of housing on the site, which is about 2/3 of our respondents, there was overwhelming support for both multifamily building types and specifically affordable housing. And one other aspect of the survey clearly identified a desire for the convention center uses to be re-examined and potentially reused specifically for the housing portion, which would obviously preserve more open space on the remainder of the site. So many respondents thought that the conference center could be redeveloped as housing. And we asked some open-ended questions about areas of concern, and there were many different types of reactions, but some of the challenges that bubbled up obviously were barriers to affordable housing, traffic impacts, and other infrastructural impacts of potential development. In terms of opportunities, many people saw an opportunity to improve water quality, improve recreational opportunities, to preserve nature, and things of that nature. The public input that we've gathered so far already reflects many of the priorities identified by recent planning efforts. The recent growth incentive zone and downtown zoning have directed development growth closer to the denser parts of town, for instance, and the housing needs assessment and housing production plan have underscored the need for much more affordable housing in Hyannis. The open space plan in particular calls on the town to both protect and expand open space, particularly as a tool to address environmental justice communities and to protect ecological assets. The Twin Brooks site is not just a standalone condition, but actually part of a larger ecological and tidal system, including Joshua's Brook and Stewart's Creek, with subsurface water connections from Aunt Betty's and Fawcett's Pond all the way to Lewis Bay and Nantucket Sound. There is a potential here to think more holistically and proactively about the role of the landscape and its impacts on the underlying environmental health of the town. The site is also completely surrounded by environmental justice communities as defined by the state. In this case, predominantly low-income and minority populations. The open space and recreation plan specifically identifies that one of the ways the community can address environmental injustices is through open space and recreational resource planning, and we see a very powerful opportunity here. Many ideas came up in our conversations with community members that ranged from active recreation to educational opportunities to public pathways to regenerative landscapes and restoring native habitat. All of these ideas are possible on the open space portions of this site and reflect many of the goals of the town's open space and recreation plan already. An open space framework for the site could in fact include all of these things. The site is large enough to host a whole spectrum of uses that range from, again, regenerative and passive areas to much more active recreational uses, all of which could complement and support potential residential and other uses on the site and in the surrounding neighborhoods. We explored several design alternatives as a way to see what was possible in the site. All of the design scenarios have these sort of underlying similarities. One was a distinct goal to increase housing affordability in a greater variety of building types. The other, as sort of directed by some of our community engagement, was to consider either all or part of the convention center site as part of a broader site plan and a way to move density closer to the downtown. We identified opportunities for both pedestrian and bicycle connectivity, both through the site and to connections to the adjacent neighborhoods. And we looked at additional areas for conserved or restored open space as well as usable open space. We think that whatever the development here should have really enhanced levels of sustainability in the developed portion, including stormwater runoff management and environmental energy conservation. And in all of these, we are presenting schemes that have fewer units than the proposed development, again, to minimize some of the potential impacts to the surrounding town. These, I think most importantly, is that these alternatives represent a series of options rather than a sort of single idea. And our intention is really not to close down discussion, but really the opposite, which is to expand the discussion of what might be possible here. We have three possibilities for site plan that use varying amounts of the land in different portions of the site. Option one is 13 acres and is limited to the convention center site. Option two uses more of what's currently the sort of golf course area. And option three is a little bit in between. The first option we call mid-density consists of 250 units, which is still quite a large development. It's also confined to the convention center site to see really what was possible in terms of maximizing preservation of open space. The mid to low density schemes are a little bit smaller, between 150 and 200 units, and in varying degrees reuse or adapt uses to the conference center site and create more of a blend. And then the low density scheme is about 150 units, mostly in smaller building types such as townhouses, and again, only on the conference center site. The mid-density scheme, we envision 3-story multifamily buildings along the lines of these images here. They result in a density that's about 20 units per acre. In this scenario, we have tried to see what we could fit on the conference center site. Again, to move it closer to the downtown, to the growth incentive zone, but also as a way to see what was possible in terms of preserving as much open space as possible through the densification of the development portion of the site itself. In all of these scenarios, we are imagining increased levels of affordability. We think 20% is a very reasonable and modest goal given some of the planning and the needs that have been identified. In the case of this larger development here at 250 units, there may be opportunities for even higher levels of affordability, up to 25% or more. The second scheme, which is really a variety of different schemes, is in a sort of mid to low density. We're imagining different smaller attached building types, a more variety of some multifamily, some smaller attached, at about 11 units per acre. In this scenario, you'll see that the existing conference building is retained, but the hotel is replaced by part of a residential development that sort of works its way back into the site. And because it's a lower density, it blends a little bit more into the golf course site and some of the open space. In this scenario, we're imagining a redeveloped hotel, which is brought a little bit closer to Scudder Avenue, but also integrates with some multifamily buildings and creates a kind of transition of smaller buildings that lead the residents or the visitors out to the open space. And then the third of the mid-low density imagines that the conference center and hotel are actually replaced with a retail use along Scudder Avenue. This could be a mixed-use retail with retail on the ground floor, perhaps residential units above, even affordable units above, that feed into the residential portion of the development, but create an overall mixed-use feeling in which these uses are more blended. And the low-density scheme consists of cottage style or smaller attached dwellings, as you see here, at about 9 units per acre. In this case, we again imagined that the conference center was completely redeveloped with the housing. In this case, because the density is much lower and the building types are smaller, they sort of use more of the golf course site to retain that sort of low density. This is clearly an option that is looking more towards a kind of village or neighborhood scale. Again, but the lack of density within the development means that perhaps more of the open space needs to be used. And this is an overall image taken from one of the mid to low density schemes where we imagine that the hotel has been redeveloped. And what this image is really trying to communicate is that there are opportunities for everything here, including active and more public uses up closer to Scudder Avenue, as well as a very robust, deep, and quite large open space that is really not just a standalone open space, but part of a broader ecosystem that consists of the brooks, the tidal areas. And we also believe that there is an opportunity for fairly significant housing density here that will blend appropriately with the adjacent neighborhood and provide the right kind of scale, which will enhance not only the housing supply in Hyannis, but again, blend very well into that open space. We think that all of these schemes should have enhanced levels of sustainable building practices, including permeable pavings in the parking lot, sensitive use of native drought-tolerant plants, energy conservation measures such as solar panels or enhanced insulation. All of these are possible here. We believe that in each of these schemes, that these kinds of sustainable building practices should be prioritized. We've thought about implementation and feasibility. And I think one thing is clear is that these more creative approaches may require other funding sources and may not be wholly supportable by market rate activity. We think that there are a variety of ways that this development could be approached creatively, using both additional funds such as affordable housing funds or state funds for green infrastructure or resiliency. There are a number of public-private partnerships that could be considered, as well as other ways for the town to think through Community Preservation Act. A typical example of affordable housing, particularly deeply affordable low-income housing, is through typical tax credits. These projects tend to range from 45 to 60 units and provide deeply affordable, 100% deeply affordable housing. These are very common. There is a queue for funding, but these occur with some frequency around the Commonwealth. In addition, there are other types of funding, such as the mass housing workforce funds, which are really intended to increase the levels of affordability in projects that might already be market viable or developed as a market rate development. This has been very successful in Eastham. And again, it's only to present that there are a variety of ways in which these types of funds could help us achieve goals of greater affordability. There are also state funds for green infrastructure, such as the planning work that was done in the town of Watertown. These are funds aimed at protecting the environment, particularly one where there are a variety of systems coming together, such as the site at Twin Brooks. And there are also state funds for infrastructure, particularly MassWorks, which is a program that leverages private development to expand beyond the scope of that private development to include and enable public infrastructural improvements that have greater benefit to the town. There are state and federal funds for open space, resiliency, and particularly for environmental justice communities. This is an interesting example of what groundwork south coast of Massachusetts was able to do in New Bedford in terms of engaging an environmental justice community in open space uses such as in gardening and agriculture. And there is eminent domain, which if not used directly is sometimes used as a bargaining chip or negotiation tool for the acquisition of extremely important community assets, such as the Cape Cod Sea Camps in Brewster. And as the Barnstable Land Trust is aware of, there is private philanthropic investment, which is involves private entities really identifying sensitive landscapes and gathering the needed funds to both acquire and protect certain types of environmentally sensitive assets. And there are public-private partnership models which are extremely relevant to here. This is a project that public-private partnership that occurred in Stowe, Massachusetts, that involved a partnership between the town, the golf course, and it also involved the addition of housing. So these are things that are all very possible.
So the key takeaways from this presentation are that these concepts are all doable. They have all been done other places. They are ideas that reflect input from a very diverse group of residents and align with priorities already identified in town planning efforts. There are opportunities to address community goals on these sites in a balanced way. And opportunities to develop more Hyannis specific approaches. It may take more time. It may require other than market rate development, but the town has the regulatory authority here to seek development options more closely aligned with its planning goals. And there's no question that the development that happens here will be precedent setting for both the town and other towns on Cape Cod. And what we let or make happen here can impact the future uses of other golf courses and other open spaces all over the Cape. So it's really, really important how we approach this project. So we thank you for watching this presentation. And if you would like to learn more, you can go to Barnstable Land Trust's website at www.blt.org/twin-brooks. And we really hope that you will engage in this really important conversation. Thank you.